Today we're going to start off by talking about the cantata. So you can follow along with me on your sheet that is titled at the top, Baroque Musical Forms. The term cantata, invented in Italy in the 17th century, refers to a piece of music written for voice or voices and instruments. It applies broadly to works for solo voice, multiple soloists, vocal ensemble, and with instrumental accompaniment of either keyboard or instrumental ensemble. So that really is wide open. Like that could be a lot of different things. It can be a single movement work or consist of multiple movements. That just means parts. And the text can be either sacred or secular. It tended to replace the older terms and forms of the motet and the madrigal, more popular in the Renaissance, and in general reflected a preference for the solo voice. And you remember when we first started talking about the Baroque period that there was that group that came forward and said that you just need the solo voice to give you the kind of expression that you want. Hang on, my hair is like disappearing weirdly. I'm going to see if I can turn a light on and make it look a little better. Hold on. Huh, voila. I have a little more hair. It's weird. Okay, by Bach's time, 1685 to 1750, cantatas were generally works that contained several movements or distinct sections with tempo and key changes. If a work did not feature a solo voice at any point, it was usually called a motet instead of a cantata. The composers in Germany were quite familiar with the Italian cantata and copied its structure. Bach's immediate predecessors, including Buxtehude, and earlier generations of the Bach family were active creators of cantatas, generally sacred works based on biblical texts or sometimes on choral texts from the previous century. These types of cantatas were usually performed during a Lutheran church service. Bach's earliest compositions in this form adhere to the structure of the 17th century cantata, a work in several sections, including tempo, meter, and key changes, but highly integrated and often without any interruption. And you should understand that when you're listening to a symphony, a lot of times there between parts or between sections, there'll be a big pause, and almost to the point where people might start clapping or think the whole thing is done. And in a cantata, it just goes straight from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, usually without a break. A vocal ensemble or chorus generally began and ended the piece unless it was preceded by an instrumental sinfonia, a movement for orchestra alone, generally meditative, using musical material unrelated to the subsequent movements. It's clear from Bach's own writings and for his overall oeuvre, however, that he was interested in expanding and reinventing this form. So when we were talking about the instrumental sinfonia, I don't know how many of you go to a more traditional church, but I know that at our church we have a prelude, and that's basically just music that is playing nicely at the beginning by the organ or maybe the piano and some other instruments. Usually doesn't have any singers, and it's just meant to kind of get you in the mindset for worship. It's not meant for you to talk during it. You're supposed to just sit down and start to prepare for the worship service. I know a lot of churches don't do it that way, but this is pretty much where that came from. The Lutheran church services during the early 18th century were lengthy by our standards, running close to 3 hours, including readings, a sermon, a hymn, chorale singing. Luther was an advocate for music as an art form that inspired spiritual devotion, so musical settings of the Psalms and other biblical passages were popular interludes during the service. The cantata as a genre was generally placed after the sermon or two-part works bracketing the sermon. So like if there's a first half and then the sermon would happen and then the second half would happen, to serve as a musical counterpart to the preacher's message. Bach's early cantatas generally conformed to the 17th century model for sacred works, using pre-existing biblical or chorale texts. But by 1714, he began to use librettos, pre-existing poems written by contemporaries which expand on a biblical or liturgical theme and explore some of the personal implications for the believer. So that would be kind of the difference between just straight up singing Bible verses and singing someone else's a little bit more flowery interpretation of Bible verses that maybe direct the message more toward modern day listeners. These libretti, that would be more than one libretto, um, generally consist of 5 or more movements, including recitative and aria sections, which we're going to talk about in a second. There were many people composing sacred libretti during Bach's lifetime, and we are only aware of a few individuals whose libretti Bach set, and most of them are anonymous. The official listing of Bach's works, the Bach Werke Verzeichnis, abbreviated BWV, begins with the cantatas. I'm not actually going to read the rest of this little paragraph right here, but you will see if you look up any of Bach's works that his name will be listed, and then the name of the song will be listed, and then next to it, it'll always say BWV, and then it'll have a number. And that is just a catalog number, and it actually doesn't have to do with like how early or how late a song was, composed, or anything really about it, other than this is just the order in which they cataloged the pieces, because some of Bach's pieces were lost for like hundreds of years. So even if they were written earlier in his life, if they were found later, then they ended up having a bigger BWV number. Anyway, in case you ever see that, I wondered what that was for the longest time. Prior to Bach's appointment in Leipzig in 1723, he had written less than 35 cantatas. That's still a lot. When he arrived in Leipzig, he undertook a project to compose a new cantata for every Sunday and feast day of the church year. During the first 5 years of this project, he composed some 300 cantatas. However, at least a third of these have been lost. Bach's total output of vocal works includes 6 motets, 3 passions, and several oratorio-length pieces, and a number of secular cantatas written for public occasions of mourning or celebration. I'm going to post on your Google form an example of a Bach cantata that was performed much more modern day, like recently, by I think it was a Bach group in the Netherlands. But you will hear how just unbelievably intricate and carefully done and beautifully done this piece is. And you might look at it and think to yourself, well, he probably spent months or years working on it. No, he literally wrote a new one of these every single week for every single church service. And you might think, well, we're only playing the ones that are really good. They are all actually that good. I understand some of you are probably like, Mrs. Bexford, stop being such a nerd. I just can't stop. Bach's music is unbelievable, and even if you don't enjoy listening to it, to look at how complex it is and then understand that he wrote them for every single week, it is just mind-blowing. That guy had a work ethic that did not stop. Okay, I am at the part on the page where it says, what is a chorale? A Lutheran chorale is a hymn intended to be sung by the congregation during a service. These works are based on tunes from the early 16th century or even earlier, which were adapted by early Lutherans for the new faith, like during the Reformation. The chorale texts, sometimes running to 20 verses, were also largely from the Renaissance. Many of these texts were authored by Martin Luther himself, but there were many chorale writers and composers, and often several sets of texts were associated with the same tune. That's true. So they would like borrow each other's music and just put different words with it. And it wasn't considered like copyright violation. It was just something that was done back then. It was called parodying. Which these days, if you hear about a parody, you think it's someone making fun of someone else's music by putting strange words in or different words, like Weird Al Yankovic does parodies all the time. But back then, when they would do a parody, it was done in seriousness. Like they would say, oh, I like that tune. I have some great words. I'm just going to stick them together. And that was the thing they did. These tunes and texts were very familiar to Bach's congregation, and he employed them in the vast majority of his cantatas. The most common use of chorales was as a conclusion to the piece, generally in a 4-part harmonization where the tune would be prominently audible. Remember, Martin Luther wanted that tune to be very clearly heard by the congregation so they could even sing it along if they wanted to. But Bach incorporated the melodies and the texts in many different ways. There is an entire cycle of cantatas based entirely on chorales, where the chorale is featured in every movement. Clearly, the use of chorales enabled Bach to reach out to his listeners in a very immediate way. A familiar phrase could automatically recall the rest of the content and add a layer of meaning to the music. maybe this isn't a big deal to you, but I think a lot of times about concerts I've gone to, not even like classical concerts, just concerts of groups and musicians that I really like. And I remember times when they would play music that was maybe brand new or that I didn't know, and I didn't like it. Like, I didn't want to sit there and just listen to something I wasn't familiar with. But as soon as they started playing something I knew, all the words to every song I knew would just come rushing back, and I loved it so much more, and it was so much more meaningful to me. And I understand that, Bach chorales probably, you're like, what does this have to do with it? But if you're sitting in church, and keep in mind, 3-hour church service, and all of a sudden this music starts and you start to hear a tune and you for sure know the words to it, even if they're not singing the words, you're thinking the words because you know the song. And Bach and the minister of the church very carefully selected those words in that tune to go along with his sermon to really drive the point home. It probably made it a much more enjoyable experience rather than sitting through 3 hours of the pastor just talking and talking and talking and just, random other stuff going on. I'm sure it really was quite a pleasure for his congregation. I don't know if they knew how good they had it, actually. So we're at a part that says, what is an aria? An aria is a movement for a solo voice, or sometimes a duet or trio, but honestly, it's almost always a soloist, and an instrumental accompaniment. A Bach aria was composed to a section of the libretto and remember that's the text that maybe is not straight from the Bible, but it's a kind of Bible-ish. In a regular meter, generally with symmetrical rhyming lines. Bach arias sometimes feature a solo instrument and sometimes are written for the full orchestra to accompany. But the important thing about aria is that it's always just like a solo vocalist with just like a piano, well, it wouldn't be piano, but like a harpsichord background. These days it would be just a soloist with a piano. And that might seem like the simplest thing in the world, but it actually was kind of a new thing during Bach's time. What is a recitative? A recitative, invented in the 17th century Italy by the pioneers of opera, is a sung movement that is meant to resemble speech. It generally has very sparse accompaniment, keyboard and bowed bass instrument like a cello, and the singer has many words to sing on short note values. The structure of a recitative is much more fluid than that of an aria. It's not built out of a melody, but rather a harmonic progression. The voice part outlines and embellishes this progression while declaiming the text in natural speech rhythms. The recitative sections of the libretti were more narrative or dramatic than the arias, focusing on explaining or preaching a concept to the congregation. They were generally longer than the aria texts and not as tightly structured in their meter, rhyme scheme, or overall line count. Some Bach recitatives are structured as duets, dialogues between two voices, sometimes given actual character names such as Jesus and the Soul. Some are composed with full instrumental accompaniment and are called accompagnato. These orchestrated movements tend to be more emotionally elevated than the plain or secco dry recitatives. Okay, that was really wordy, and I understand it was probably complicated. I want to give you an idea of the difference between an aria and a recitative. Okay, so for instance, we will use Mr. Hill as an example. He has no idea I'm doing this. All right, if I was going to sing an aria about Mr. Hill, okay, I would have to make it sound pretty. I would have to make the endings of the words rhyme. So let me think a second. I'm doing this just right off the top of my head. I might sing, and a lot of times I sing the same word, but I like move the notes a lot. So I might go, Mr. Hill, Mr. Hill is the best teacher in the school. Mr. Hill, Mr. Hill, Mr. Hill is very, very cool. There you go. There's an aria about Mr. Hill, except for I don't have a piano with me. So there would be like a lovely piano. It would be playing something lovely along. But notice, like, I sing that and I put all sorts of notes with it. And the word school and the word cool rhyme. Okay? Now, so that's aria. But if I'm going to now sing a recitative about Mr. Hill, it's going to have lots of word. It's going to get lots of information out to you, but it's not going to have all that like flowery up and down notes. So I might sing, Mr. Hill makes his room open to you so that you can do the work for this class. He's very, very nice to you and sometimes passes out the candy that I give to him to give to you. He makes sure that you have all the papers that you need, and he keeps everything very organized, and additionally, it smells really nice in here. There. I just said a lot of stuff. It wasn't very flowery. It sort of sounded like I was just talking to you, because that's what it's supposed to be. And I didn't bother making it rhyme, and I don't have to, and recitative doesn't have to rhyme. So, anyway, I hope that little aria and recitative about Mr. Hill is helpful in getting you to understand the difference between aria and recitative. Okay, and my computer is running out of battery right now, so I'm going to get to the end of this section and plug it in and make another video. So here I go. What makes a Bach cantata special? While many of Bach's contemporaries were actively engaged in writing cantatas, Telemann being the best known, Bach seized on this form to do some of his most experimental composition. And of course he could, because remember, he was writing them for every single week. He needed to be doing cool stuff and different stuff. He tried to change it up as much as he could. He frequently used his musical ideas to illuminate, deepen, and sometimes contradict the message found in the text. Think about that. If something in the text was supposed to sound like sad or whatever, and he wrote a really happy, joyful something, then probably if you were snoozing in your seat after the 3-hour church service, now you're going to wake up. You're going to be like, that doesn't make sense. He did it on purpose, right? The cantata in Bach's hands morphed from being a work of devotion to being a work of penetrating psychological exploration. Every emotion is laid bare and dissected, and the painful paradoxes of being human, desiring the good but falling into temptation, fear, and sin are brought to vivid life by Bach's music. And that is such a Baroque thing. Remember, we talked about how Baroque music is all about the doctrine of the affections, about all that emotion. Bach was the master of that. Every musical device available to an 18th century composer is put into service, and Bach invents countless new ones in order to startle his listeners into engagement with the subject. The complexity, ambition, and harmonic daring of the greatest Bach cantatas had absolutely no rival among Baroque composers, and were probably puzzling and disturbing to his first listeners, as they can also be to us today. So that is a little thing about cantatas, which, you know, Bach was the master of writing those. Absolutely amazing. In your Google form today, underneath this video, I'm going to put a Bach cantata for an example, the one that I said from that Bach group from the Netherlands. I want you to listen to, I would say, at least maybe 5 minutes of it. I'm not going to expect you to listen to the whole thing, but I do want you to jump around in the video a little bit so that you catch the portions that are totally instrumental. I want you to catch portions where it has everyone singing together. I want you to try to catch examples of aria and recitative. I also think there's a possibility that in this one, there's a guy singing alto. So he is singing super, super high. You should enjoy that too. I think it's in this example. If it's not, I apologize. But enjoy watching that Bach cantata. And when I catch you again on the next video, we're going to talk about concerto.